If you spent more than a few minutes hanging around this channel, you've likely heard about quote-unquote my definition of survival horror, which is actually something I would argue doesn't exist. See, I don't necessarily have a personal definition for the genre. Instead, I use the games that named and popularized it as a measuring stick. Does it have a majority of the gameplay features found in RE1 or Code Veronica? Well, it's likely a good contender for that survival horror label. Now, I'm sure there's a little wiggle room in there, but that's the gist. So why start this video with that point? Well, it seems like survival horror has become a hot topic in the independent gaming scene, which means more games are being made in a category I love. Good news, right? Well, there's always the age-old quality over quantity argument, but realistically, I'll take more survival horror representation in the industry over less any day. Which brings us right back around to Tormented Souls, a new horror title looking to take what made RE and Silent Hill so great and form it into a new, creepier form. So does it live up to the obvious expectations that come with such a motivation? Will a modern title finally fall into the objective standards used to define what is and is not survival horror, and most importantly, are there really any true Scotsmen? Well, let's find out. What's up, guys? I'm Jared, and this is Avalanche Reviews.
My child, this place is giving you hallucinations. You must rest.
Tormented Souls is a brand new horror title, first released on Steam and now seemingly making its way to consoles. A title you'd think I was mega excited for, seeing as how like 70% of this channel is me complaining these games don't exist anymore. And yes, it is most definitely awesome to see the genre I love getting some near mainstream attention lately. But you guys know me, I'm very particular as to what is and is not survival horror, and sadly a majority of titles seem to miss that mark more often than not. So when one of these games ends up making an impact, I'm almost discouraged to play it, which I know is dumb, but think about it. Survival horror has always been a very small, less approachable standard, so when a large group starts getting hyped about one of these games, it almost immediately has the opposite effect on me. Well, I finally came out of the rock I live under and decided to give the Tormented Souls demo a try on Steam a few weeks back, and to say the least, I was very impressed. On one hand, there were the obvious earmarks of an independently produced game, but on the other was a game that, dare I even say it, lived up to the genre it claimed to be a part of. Against all odds, it seems like we finally have a traditional survival horror game to play that isn't old enough to legally join the military, and holy hell, that feels really good to say. So now that we know what we're working with, that of course being a genuine artifact from a bygone era, why don't we take a look and see what kind of story it's trying to tell. Tormented Souls starts out pretty unassumingly. The main character, Caroline, is chilling at home when she receives a letter in the mail. Apparently, it was sent from a Canadian hospital and includes a picture of two twins. On the back is a message about someone being abandoned, and when Caroline looks at it, she gets this weird feeling and a sharp pain. Wondering why she would react like that and who the hell's out there in Canada just sending out pics of twins, Caroline heads to the Wildberger Hospital. Upon arrival, we find out it's definitely not what you would call a 5-star medical facility, but before getting a chance to file a health and safety complaint, she's smacked upside the head and knocked out. Now, waking up from a head injury naked, in a tub, and with a tube plunged down your throat is not a desirable scenario even in the best of times, but if there was one worse fate, it would be doing all that and then realizing your eye had been taken out while you were unconscious. So now that Caroline is awake and lacking some real depth perception, the mission must continue, just with a few more questions added to the list. And if you ask me, the process Caroline goes through to get the scant amount of facts she's actually able to acquire drip-fed to her is just classic survival horror storytelling. The pace of this story could likely be described as relatively slow in any other context, but this genre is sort of built on the practice of keeping the player as unaware for as long a period as humanly possible. Surely there are going to be those of you who aren't down for that kind of a slow burn, and honestly that's fair, but I would say the eventual reveal is definitely worth sticking with it. Much like the games that obviously inspired it, a good chunk of the story here is going to be delivered through notes, journal entries, and random documents. This is a style I have always really enjoyed. It sort of conjures up images of the good George Romero films where relevant plot details would be delivered through personal anecdotes and stories of past experiences. So throughout Tormented Souls, you'll be reading what seems like random maintenance reports or medical journals, but key events and characters will get further resolved in the process. Not only is this yet another anchor firmly keeping this title in the realm of survival horror, but it's also a method of storytelling that always just sort of spoke to me. But this is a visual medium, so let's cover the other end of the narrative structure. On top of these scattered journals and receipts, you'll get some of the story told to you directly by other characters, and I think if there was a hierarchy of flaws in this game, this would likely be near the top. Don't get me wrong, the story beats are great. It might be a little predictable, but it's an interesting story concerning a cold, barbaric religious practices and sacrifices. You know, the Silent Hill trifecta. So I couldn't stop loving the tale itself, but it's the way that it's told that causes a few issues. And before going forward, I want to make it very clear I'm not trying to clown on anyone, so hopefully in critiquing some of this stuff it doesn't come across that way. And I say that because it seems to me that the people who wrote this story, while doing a really great job at writing it, might not have used English as a first language. Now, I certainly don't expect everyone in the world to excel at the language I'm barely good at, but there were pieces of dialogue where this seemed to shine through even more than the story being told. Now, this is something I assume most people would at the very least notice, but it's my opinion it doesn't necessarily ruin this story. If we had a voice cast talented enough to smash through such an obstruction, it might counterbalance things, but sadly that is not the case here. The two major characters in this game have really nice sounding voices, which is something I really do appreciate. The priest has a lower, more soothing sound to his voice, and Caroline's really fits the physical look of her character model. The only issue being they aren't the greatest voice actors in my opinion. Both share the same issue where they don't use any abbreviations or shorthand. They seem to over-enunciate every single solitary word from the script as if they were speaking so that someone who was hard of hearing could make them out.
Father, what's going on here? Why is that weird man walking around the operating table with that weird chandelier in his hands?
Oh, it's you. Don't you remember me? I'm the town priest. We met here in the chapel only a couple of days ago.
It's like if I were to read the rest of my script perfectly pronouncing every word I came across. Sure, it may be proper English, but it would sound overly robotic and sort of odd. Now, in all fairness, this could have been a purposeful inclusion. After all, Silent Hill took advantage of odd vocal cues to show through words the mental problems Angela was dealing with. So maybe there's a chance that's going on here, but the actual script these people are reading from contains very subtle grammar errors and just off-sounding things that sort of tilt me closer to the non-native English speaker explanation. The good news is this actually does help add to the tense atmosphere the game does such a great job of cultivating. I remember playing the first Silent Hill game and getting very frustrated every time one of the townspeople would answer a simple question with some kind of cryptic riddle, or when Harry would fail to get clarification on something delivered far too vaguely for anyone to really understand. And I think there's at least some of that present here. Sure, you might argue it wasn't included on purpose, but the off feeling it gives does work in favor of the general story if you ask me. Plus, it's important to keep in mind this was not a multi-million-dollar production, and trust me, whatever the budget for this thing was, that money was put to great use in other areas, I assure you. So I'm not personally going to take off points for some stilted dialogue and botched delivery, but it's definitely worth pointing out so you can decide if that's something that might bother you. And if it is, I would just kindly recommend you never go anywhere near Resident Evil 1. I kind of shortly mentioned pacing before, and that's another thing I think this team really nailed. You get this meager amount of info to drive you forward at the start, and from there you can only really count on the odd breadcrumb keeping you going till the end. The way things are structured, every time I'd start to feel myself losing interest in the game, it would hit me with some small piece of story, and just like that I was back in it. Now, I don't expect everyone to enjoy a slower-paced story, but for those of you who cut their teeth on early survival horror legends, this is going to feel so damn familiar, it'd be easy to think that this was some late 90s PS1 title you accidentally skipped over. The themes present here are not only very genre-appropriate in my opinion, but they dabble in the darker side of things, which is always nice to see. I will say the story definitely has more inspiration coming from early Silent Hill than Resident Evil as far as content goes, but its more straightforward method of telling that story definitely feels more like RE. And if you're not good at math, let me go ahead and solve that equation for you. These two things added together equals absolute heaven. So I'd like to talk about more, but this is a newer game, and it's also a story I'd want everyone to experience for themselves, so consider this your spoiler warning. If this is a game you really want to jump into on your own, skip to the timestamp on screen, use the chapters in the playback bar, or click the link in the description. Sound good? Alright, cool. During her investigation of this decrepit hospital, Caroline learns about an ancient tribe who believed sacrificing twins to their god or godlike deity, I never really worked out which, will bring about his return. Some of the more fanatical members of this group seem to have at some point sectioned themselves off into their own even more secret cult, and what preceded was a whole lot of human experiments with the goal of creating twins artificially. As some of you guys probably figured out pretty early on, the two girls in the picture at the start of the game were one such pair of twins, but when the time came to start the sacrificing, their mother tried to keep them alive, and as a result she died and one of the twins escaped. So most of you probably jumped to this conclusion before I even finished that sentence, and yes, you're right, Caroline is 100% that missing twin. The unassuming priest you've been relying on throughout the whole game turns out to be the guy responsible for Caroline's near brush with death, and in the meantime, he's been doing some real nasty shit with the sister that wasn't lucky enough to get away. So at the end of the game, we not only get the reveal that Caroline is one of the girls from the picture that drew her here, but that the other girl is actually a persistent enemy that's been trying to kill her for half the game. And to be honest, that latter revelation was the most interesting to me. Having someone act as a constant threat and then revealing you're somehow related to that person is a more interesting move than the tried and true amnesia angle. Now, I'm not shitting on the ending or anything, I actually really liked it, but in the spirit of being consistent, it is without a doubt just the whole Silent Hill 2 thing all over again. You guys know what I'm talking about, that age-old character comes to place to investigate something but ends up uncovering a long-buried mental trauma that led to some kind of purposeful amnesia thing. Sure, you could argue it's a well-worn path, and I do often, but in the game's defense, there's more going on than just the main character getting her memory back. Personally, I chose to focus more on the location, the cult's backstory, and the side characters, but the less cynical part of me did enjoy the ending revelation a little more than I'd like to admit. And that is all the spoiler-related stuff I wanted to talk about, so why don't we let everyone else back in. So not only did I enjoy the story of Tormented Souls, but I also really liked how it ended. Without giving too much away, let's just say this. You know how the game basically plays like a product of mashing Silent Hill and Resident Evil together in equal parts? Well, let's just say the story and subject matter is 100% Silent Hill. I'd love to go into more detail, but I think one of the best things about playing a game relatively close to its release date is that no one can really ruin that first experience for you. So you'll just have to take me at my word when I say that this game does a shitload to make sure fans of old survival horror games feel right at home. Typically, you'd expect something like that to be said about gameplay or graphics, but I really appreciate these guys making sure the story also felt accurate to what you would have likely seen in the genre back in its heyday. Of course, you do have to keep in mind I have a very clear and vocal bias towards experiences like this, so if you aren't a fan of the totality of survival horror, I can't really promise you'll appreciate all the work done to make sure this game feels like a title in the genre, but I think the story should be a little more universal. Just know that you'll start out knowing nothing, and that veil will eventually be fully lifted, but it might be during the last few minutes of your playthrough. For old horror fans, this pacing and style will be very familiar and very comforting, but I can't really say whether or not this will be appealing to people outside of this odd little group we have here. Either way, I can only really say how I feel personally here, and I can't stress enough how much I enjoyed this story. It gave me flashbacks to some of my favorite franchises, but not in some kind of a derivative, uninspired way. Tormented Souls certainly follows a strict survival horror checklist when adding anything to the game, and I'm just happy that list included story elements. Yes, the actual storytelling can be brought down slightly by a voice cast that's, well, less than convincing, and a script that may or may not have been the product of a person who didn't necessarily have a native level understanding of the English language, but let's be totally honest here, that only makes it all the more accurate to the genre. I mean, really, would you have it any other way? Regardless of how much time you spent with early 90s horror games though, I think this will be a story that you'll enjoy. It's dark and mysterious in ways you don't really see outside of the point-and-click adventure world of games, so please do give it a try. It's a massive breath of fresh air as a game, and the story was exactly what I hoped for. I know I've been pretty vague here, but the goal is to spoil as little of this story as possible, so if any of this seems even a little bit interesting to you, slap a 20 down and give Tormented Souls a whirl. It's been the most interesting time I've had with the new game in years, and I think it'll have a similar effect on you guys, and if it doesn't, well, I'm not exactly above claiming this whole video was made sarcastically, so don't tempt me. If there's one thing regular viewers of this channel know above all else, it's that I have a borderline inappropriate relationship with old survival horror games. I can't really specify why that is, but there's just something about this odd fusion of elements that speaks to me on what seems like a genetic level. And it is my supreme and absolute pleasure to say in no uncertain terms that Tormented Souls is the return of that genre in all of its glory. But before I go off on that crazy ass tangent, let's lay things out and see what we're dealing with here. TS feels and plays like the bastard child of some kind of unholy union between RE1 and SH1. You move around with tank controls if you're using the D-pad and 3D style controls with the analog stick, so needless to say, I was using the D-pad the entire time. Exploration is the key draw here, with the hospital seeming very small at first, but as you find more items and solve more puzzles, more and more of it starts to reveal itself, which is the real draw here and really for all games in this genre. In a title like this, it's not so much about being mechanically skilled at the game, that is to say pushing the right buttons at exactly the right time, but instead it's about planning and execution. It's not about following a waypoint on your map to an enemy encounter and then having your skills be the only determining factor for whether or not you proceed. It's more about finding a porcelain hand and remembering, oh yeah, that's right, there's a door in that hallway that requires a knocker. And at that point, the next 10 minutes of the game is basically played inside your mind. You gotta ask yourself questions like, what items do I have with me? Are there any enemies on my route? And if I do get jumped, would I rather spend resources to heal myself after a risky dodge or on ammo used to engage in combat? Like I've said before, this genre as a whole is based on puzzle solving, and just getting from point A to point B can certainly be approached the same way you would any other puzzle. And if you ask me, this style of exploration is the element Tormented Souls nails best. The Wildberger Hospital started off feeling claustrophobically small, but I kept finding new areas, and eventually I was crisscrossing this mammoth compound by memory, and I think that's a really good testament to this game's developers. One of the bigger parts involved in making a good survival horror game is designing the environment and the player's path through it in such a way that they are revisiting previous locations, but in order to keep things from feeling stale, having that serve as a method by which other areas can be unlocked. And on top of that, the path they take has to be one that's relatively intuitive. You know, something like, I can't cross this water because it's electrified, I guess I'll go turn off the generator. In doing that, you are unconsciously programming the game's layout into the player's head, and if you doubt that, try this. Take a piece of paper out and draw the layout of the Spencer Mansion from RE1, just the first floor. I'm willing to bet a good portion you guys could do that no problem. And that's because throughout the course of beating the game, you've likely been from one corner of that mansion to the other a good 100 times. TS had that same exact effect on me. When I got a new item or key, I always not only knew exactly where I could use it, but I had also memorized the quickest path to get there. I know I'm harping on about this a lot, but truly this was one hell of an achievement. Most developers would have made the game more linear so that they could appeal to a much wider audience, but damn it, I'm glad they didn't go that route. And since we're talking survival horror, we absolutely have to talk combat. The point to any good game in this genre that's worth its weight in ink ribbons is to simultaneously make combat so punishing that you don't really want to engage in it, but give the player enough options that they can if they want to, or need to. The point there being to conserve resources. So you might think, well, if I want more ammo to deal with bigger threats later, I'll just run past starting enemies and voila. But in actuality, you stand a pretty good chance of taking damage while trying to scurry past a guy in a wheelchair with knife hands. So it becomes a decision of which do I want to theoretically risk, my healing resources or my offensive ones. And if that's our metric, I can say this is yet another element TS excels at. And I could go about explaining that in some kind of a wordy, complicated manner, but instead let's use a little analogy. Say there's this, I don't know, amazingly attractive bald guy. Now, this is someone who's been playing these games since his preteen years and someone who specifically excels at having an entire inventory filled with ammo by the end of an RE game. So when it came time to start up Tormented Souls, he assumed he had nothing to worry about in that department. Until about 3 hours in when he downed a bad guy and opened his inventory to see he had used his very last bit of ammo. In all seriousness, this is not something that happens to me too often in survival horror games, so when I found myself having to restart because I wasn't sure I was in a position where I could get any more ammo anytime soon, I was grinning from ear to ear. It honestly felt great, kind of like the master had suddenly become the student. After that first restart, I did develop a method to get to my typical state of being overburdened with ammunition by the end, but I'm blown away I had to restart with a more serious mindset before I got to that point. I went in thinking I could just coast my way through this one because I was so experienced in this kind of system, but it made me work for every bullet I got my hands on, and I see that as a huge plus in its favor. After all, this is a genre based around challenging the player in a way that they likely weren't used to being challenged. Execution and mechanical expertise means almost nothing if you're not using the right tools for the right job and, more importantly, choosing the right time to use them. So yeah, this game is award-worthy in my mind just because of its strict adherence to a set of blueprints I'm very familiar with and very fond of, but that doesn't mean it's perfect. This being a smaller independent production, you are most definitely going to see the telltale signs of a not massive budget. For example, you can't fire your starting weapon too fast, but I found there's a rhythm to getting more shots out. The only problem is if you mess that rhythm up, you have to wait even longer to fire the next shot. This may have been intentional, but it makes the game feel like there's a lag between you pressing fire and the character actually firing. There's all kinds of clipping issues with my light illuminating things behind doors or around corners of walls, and I found that some parts of the environment don't have proper collision detection, which let me walk over things I'm pretty sure I'm not supposed to be able to stand on. I did also have the game lock up and crash on me once, and in its defense it never happened again, but that first crash caused me about a good hour of progress. Now these aren't massive deals in my opinion, but on the plus side, they seem to be easy problems to solve with a patch or two. And speaking of problem solving, I have to drop to my knees and sing the praises of the puzzle design here. These head scratchers felt like the perfect mix of dead serious difficulty and intuitive solvability. Don't get me wrong, they took some serious thought to get through most of the time, but I was always able to figure them out on my own. Now, this is going to be a hard subject to broach because of how subjective it is, but to me these puzzles felt like just the right kind of hard and satisfying. You know, a less mature person would put a dick joke in there, but I know you guys click that subscribe button for my highbrow humor, so not happening today. Every time I thought my way through one of these things, I felt like a genius, not only because it was hard to solve, but because the clues were given in such a way that it felt like I was doing all the work instead of the game handing me the solution. If the gameplay itself is a good 50-50 split of RE and SH, I'd say the puzzles follow that trend perfectly. With Resident Evil, the puzzles often had a more mechanical feel, with objects needing to be taken to certain places or blocks needing to be pushed into place. Silent Hill, on the other hand, took a more thinking man's approach to things, with puzzles taking the form of deciphering poetry, playing music, and organizing tarot cards. Tormented Souls seems to have a solid combination of these two, and damn it, I love it. Listen, I know a game having good puzzles isn't going to be the best selling point in the world, but trust me when I say these things are works of art. All of them except for the one in the operating room. If you've played this game before, you know exactly what I'm talking about, and at first I had a whole section of this script complaining about it because I was almost certain there was no in-game journal or clues that would lead me to do the wacky stuff that need to be done in order to solve this thing. Then during a stream, fellow YouTuber Boulder Punch let me know that the solution is sort of hiding in plain sight right here in this room. I won't go any further than that, but if you're anything like me, you would never put this together unless someone told you. Typically I try not to ruin stuff like that in these videos, but since this was the only, and I mean one and only puzzle I had to resort to the internet to solve, I figure I'm just saving you the time it takes to type Tormented Souls and operating room into a search bar. Along with this playstyle, you typically expect one of its most famous mechanics, the limited inventory, so imagine my surprise when that was not the case here in TS. And to be fair, these guys have definitely been wearing their love for Silent Hill on their sleeve, and that's always been a defining feature that differentiated the series from its Capcom counterpart. Now, if you know quote-unquote my definition of survival horror, you know limited inventories very much play a part in it. Well, I've always believed you had to include a majority of the features found in early games in the genre to count, and since TS has checked literally every other box on that list, this doesn't bother me one bit. Of course, the game was balanced around the idea of not having to worry about inventory space, so it feels great in motion, but man, I would have loved to have seen an extra difficulty mode that limited how much you could carry with you at once. Besides, this still fits very firmly into my own personal rule for horror games. If you're lacking a feature found in RE, you better be compensating with one found in Silent Hill. Alright, so this game is near perfect from a survival horror point of view, but I did have a few issues. Because I'm so petty apparently, I can't stop critiquing a game even when it's providing me with the most satisfying gameplay experience I've had in years. There was this persistent stalker type enemy introduced maybe halfway through the game, and I've just never really enjoyed this type of mechanic, at least not in these type of games. This radioactive floating fatty can grab you if you're near, and even though you can wound her, she'll never really die. So if she shows up in a narrow hallway, it's just a matter of either wasting a shotgun shell to down her temporarily, or using an item to compensate for the health she took away with her grab. Now realistically, I know I'm in a very small minority with this one, but it ended up not being too much of a big deal at all eventually. After hearing her little audio cue in a tight hallway, I decided to test if she would despawn when I left the room, since she does seem to be randomized and triggered upon entering. And sure enough, when I went back into that room, bam, she was gone. So I went through the rest of the game playing normally, but if I heard that orchestral, tension-elevating music, I just ducked into the nearest room and came right back, making this one of those self-solving problems. On a positive note, the developers included a quick dodge to help with the pretty tough difficulty that comes with spacing in combat here, but unluckily I found attack animations are so slow for Caroline that even if you do hit the dodge button at frame 1 of an enemy wind-up, you better hope you were finished reloading or recovering from the recoil of an attack, because if not, you will not be dodging that swipe anytime soon. Personally, I found a much better strategy than getting close and waiting for a chance to dodge. You just hit them with the shotgun or the nail gun until they hit the ground, then switch over to the crowbar and finish them off without spending any more resources and having to dodge any melee hits. Alright, so listen, I just spent the better part of 3 pages of a script basically defining this genre in the form of a Tormented Souls review, and there's a very good reason for that. TS is the first newly released game I've played in maybe 10 years where I can confidently say it has rightfully earned the title of survival horror. It's not survival horror adjacent or survival horror like. It's not taking a swipe at the genre but also trying to interest a wider audience, and it is most certainly not a cheap clone of something that already exists. This is unequivocally the benchmark for what I call survival horror, and if you've hung out around this channel for long enough, you know exactly how much it means for a jaded, hard-headed asshole like myself to utter those words. Tormented Souls is an incredibly fun, tightly designed, and absolutely pants-pissing experience, but it's something more than that too. It's a wake-up call to you, me, and the industry at large. Hell, it's a message, and that message reads, these games still work. They're still fun as all hell, and we still want to play them. And if the AAA industry doesn't want to jump into this market, I'm certain there are a few indie developers that would be more than happy to collect that cash instead. As a guy who's been covering games like this for years now, it's not uncommon for me to get a comment basically saying that the antiquated methods for this genre just don't work in a modern context, and for the longest time I had nothing to point to as an example of that being flat out wrong. That is until now. Tormented Souls is perfection in my eyes. Not the kind of perfection that requires a lack of flaws, but instead, it's perfect for me. It's exactly what I've been screaming about on this damn channel for almost a decade now, and I'm beside myself that someone finally took up this mantle. The survival horror genre is a tough one to get into thanks to its list of quirks nearly a mile long, so I'm not sure I'll be able to convince a lot of you newcomers to pick it up just because I love it, but I can say this with absolute certainty. If you enjoy this genre, you are guaranteed to like this game. It's a love letter to survival horror fans, and I think that's fitting because I very well may have fallen in love with it. It'll run you a cool $20 over on Steam, which is such a low price for what you're getting, it's not even worth considering in my opinion. Right now it's out on current-gen consoles, and it seems to be coming out on last-gen stuff pretty soon, including the Switch, and I think that's really cool. It took me around 5 hours to clear TS on my first try, and I know that doesn't seem like the best value up front, but that's still pretty damn long in survival horror terms, and I'd be surprised if most of you didn't get at least 2 playthroughs under your belt before you're done with it. Listen, I'm gonna level with you guys. I'm sort of running out of things to say here. I came into this ready to give some sort of big speech about survival horror being back and better than ever, but what's the point? This game doesn't need that kind of diatribe to sell it. So let's break things down and make this simple. This is the first real survival horror title to be released in a very long time to my knowledge, and if that hasn't already sold you, it might not be the game for you. But if you did hear those words and thought to yourself, yes, finally, well, congratulations, you have just found your next favorite game. Just, be careful about playing it at night with headphones on. I'm not saying it sent me out of my chair and into orbit a few times, but, well, yeah, I guess that's exactly what I'm saying. Before we go in on this game's presentation, I have got to talk about its cool-ass roots. I was actually finished with this script and in the process of voicing it when Guardians Games on YouTube messaged me with a killer little factoid. Seems like Tormented Souls started its life as a mobile title, and call me crazy, but I'd still love to see this version of the game get released. From what I hear, they got pretty far into development with this mobile version before deciding to go the PC and console route, which is kind of bittersweet. Like, yeah, I did love the version of Tormented Souls I just played, but seeing this build is giving me all kinds of RE 1.5 vibes. The environments look absolutely insane, the 3D models are sweet, and the atmosphere seems like it's right on point. I'm seriously wondering if this version will ever be released in some kind of form, because it seems like they were really onto something. I'd love to see it fleshed out more. Alright, so there's a bit of an issue with analyzing this game's presentation. Tormented Souls is one of the most graphically impressive games I've seen in a very long time, but that is not coming from any objective measure. I want to be very clear from the start, everything I'm saying from here on out will be judging it as a survival horror title, which might not make sense at first. I mean, graphics are graphics, right? Well, think of it this way. You know how survival horror is known for certain elements like backtracking, item conservation, and puzzle solving? Well, in that same sense, there's a sort of graphical baseline you expect when going into one of these games. And within that criteria, this is one amazingly jaw-dropping presentation with a few flaws, but we'll get into that later. Alright, so if you've ever spoken to me in any way whatsoever, I've likely bored you to tears with some kind of argument on the merits of pre-rendered backgrounds and static camera angles. Two things Tormented Souls very much lacks, so why all the love from me? Well, TS does something I would consider to be the modern version of those two methods, starting off with its hybrid approach to its camera. The camera is static in the sense that it's on a fixed track and can only be controlled via the character's movement, so technically it's not directly controllable. And if you've ever seen my videos covering Resident Evil's Dreamcast titan Code Veronica, you'll know I've always loved this move. It's like the graphical equivalent of having your cake and eating it too. Yes, you do get the claustrophobic, artistically pleasing look of a camera pre-placed by a developer to ensure maximum creepiness and style, but you also don't have to see the world via a series of static screens. There are your more traditional fixed angles, which are definitely a sight for sore eyes, but mostly the camera will be in motion as long as Caroline is, which is without a doubt the best of both worlds. Obviously, titles like Code Veronica and Dino Crisis are going to be the first that come to mind with this approach, but if you ask me, we have a new king of this style, and it is Tormented Souls. Well, okay, that's one win, but how about pre-rendered backdrops, huh? I gotta be bummed they aren't in the game, right? Well, I guess I would be if these environments weren't so sharp, smooth, and well-designed that they might as well be pre-rendered. No joke, I'm still kind of debating whether or not what we're looking at here is fully 3D or some kind of Unity engine tricks that I don't know about. Well, either way, you just never see this much care and detail packed into a modern AAA environment nowadays. It honestly rivals the incredibly detailed backdrops from bangers like RE2 and 3. Not in the graphics department or anything, I mean, clearly this looks better than this, technically speaking, but I'm more talking in terms of artistry. For example, let's take a look at this. There are millions of small details here in this one room in the RPD. There are signs all over of a great struggle, layered over little visual cues that let you know what used to go down here before things went tits up. If I had never played RE2 before, I could pick up a controller right here in this room and make a pretty solid guess at where I was and what went down here. TS takes a very similar approach. Much of the environment here expands on the game's lore or enforces it. We can see signs of damage and disuse, letting us know this hospital has not seen too many legit patients in quite some time, but little details like papers being strewn about and the split air conditioning unit lets us know that this was a place where people used to work and congregate. I love that sort of attention to detail, and I would even go as far as saying this game right here is a much more visually pleasing game than powerhouse GPU sellers like Metro Exodus or the latest Far Cry. Every single piece of the environment here is expertly designed and placed in a way to ensure I never feel like I'm playing this game in some kind of fantasy setting. Stuff like that goes such a long way in making sure the less believable aspects of the game never take away from my suspension of disbelief. And I guess if we're talking graphics, we might need to devote a good 2/3 of this script to Tormented Souls' absolutely jaw-dropping real-time lighting engine. Or I guess I could save myself some time and just show it to you. Yeah, I mean, I could most definitely start gabbing about how realistic it looks and how naturally it reacts to the environment, but like you can already see all that. You don't really need me to tell you how great this looks. What's that old saying? The proof is in the pudding? Well, if that's the case, let's call this roundabout.
$240 worth of pudding. Oh yeah.
You know what's really insane here is the fact that that reference is, statistically speaking, older than half my audience. By the way, big ups to the 65 and older crowd subscribed to me. I think we can all agree I'm making these videos for you specifically. Okay, so we have an amazing camera system that not only looks great, but helps more than anything in selling the overall atmosphere of this game, coupled with a lighting engine that hits well above its weight, and a game world so expertly designed it puts AAA titles to shame. So where's the downside I was talking about? Well, it's right here. No, not there. Over just a bit? Yeah, there we go. Listen, I'm not trying to over-scrutinize, but it's really off-putting how porcelain smooth our heroine is. She looks almost unfinished in that sense, which normally wouldn't be too big of a deal, but the game surrounding her is so incredibly well made that she sort of sticks out by comparison. It's not all bad. I mean, her animations are pretty convincing, the wardrobe is actually cool looking, and her skirt has some pretty awesome physics attached to it. But for some reason, she just looks so damn, I guess, less well made than everything else in the game. And it's not just Caroline. The other people you run into along the way share the same sort of melted plastic look to them. I think this might be the best example though. Here, look at this item. It looks nearly photorealistic. All the bumps, scratches, and the overall texture of it really sells it as something you might find in the real world. And then by comparison, here's Caroline. It seems like maybe two separate artists might have worked on this game's presentation, one for the characters and one for environmental stuff and items. And, well, maybe one of them was a little more talented than the other. Now, I want to make sure you guys know I'm not just talking shit. What these guys have made here is infinitely impressive. In fact, that might be the problem. So much of this game is bordering on flawless that even little stuff like odd-looking characters really stand out. In that same vein, enemies often have the same plasticky kind of look to them, but since most of the time they'll either be very far off or cloaked in enough darkness that you don't really get to see any of those flaws. Some enemy animations can also be a little jerky. Mostly I see this when an enemy's winding up to attack, but you can also see how hitting a monster when they're getting up sort of skips the process of them getting up off the ground. Almost like queuing up one animation while another one is taking place will sort of just negate the last one. I also found that there were little pauses sometimes when I took damage from attacks, like the game was freezing for a second to calculate how much damage was totaled or something. You might also find that Caroline can't decide whether or not she's affected by the forces of gravity when walking up or down stairs, but with those few and very tiny flaws out of the way, let's talk about some ports. Or just one.
I'm so sorry. I'll get you out of here. First, we need to find a way to open the door.
And a massive thanks to one of my Patreon supporters, Game Over Gandhi, for capturing this footage of the PS5 release for me. Now, you guys know I love me a good port comparison, but honestly, there doesn't seem to be much else going on here that wasn't already happening in the Steam release. I mean, sure, it's definitely higher res, but to be fair, I was already running the game at 2560 by 1440, so you might not be able to tell the difference with the naked eye. So I guess don't worry too much about your chosen platform when trying to get Tormented Souls, because there doesn't seem to be any differences, or at least any I can spot. And if you couldn't already tell by looking at it, Tormented Souls is one incredible looking game. It offers up that classic survival horror look we've all loved since the 90s, but with a few modern trappings. Like I said earlier though, you sort of have to judge this game inside of its own genre, since a lot of the effects and methods survival horror fans love might count as downright flaws to a more general audience. Of course, there are graphical elements in TS that are more universally impressive, specifically the lighting, but if you'll notice while praising it, I spent most of my time comparing it to old PS1 games from the 90s, which is sort of another compliment in disguise. I mean, think about it. When was the last time we even had anything like this to look at? When was the last time a modern developer was brave enough to release a game that looks this authentically survival horror? At the GameCube era, maybe? Tormented Souls most definitely gets my undying appreciation for sticking so close to the games that inspired it, but it gets even more than that for doing it while knowing full well that will immediately limit the amount of people who are willing to pick this game up today. Genuinely, that takes balls, and I'm really happy to see a developer that actually wants to just make a video game. None of the compromises that comes from a board of directors and group-based focus testing, none of the cop-outs that happen when your inflated budget forces you to include features you hate just to draw in a bigger audience. That's something you don't see too much anymore, and I'm very glad it's not a dead practice. We're not quite finished yet, though. I would catch some serious hell if I didn't mention the absolutely amazing soundtrack on offer here. With these games, a lot of the time, the focus tends to be more on ambient, eerie tracks that don't follow your typical song structure. Usually in the genre, there's going to be a high-pitched, almost synthy sound in the foreground with a lot of reverb, but it's also going to share space with a deep droning low end that'll really add to a game's tense atmosphere. And now that I think about it, that comparison is the best thing I could say about this game's OST. It exactly mirrors what you would find in RE's 1, 2, or 3. It copies the general foundation of what made, I don't know, for example, RE2 sound so amazing, but does so in a way that keeps it from sounding derivative. And what I mean by that is it's more of an homage and less of a copy and paste job. And besides, it doesn't really matter who or what served as an inspiration, just look at this location and now listen to this. That song sounds exactly how this room looks. Each and every track has the same perfect fit to it. Plus, it's got a banger of a save room theme, something every survival horror game strives for, but few ever get to this level of quality. I have no issues giving the soundtrack 2 very large thumbs up. It's refreshing, thematically appropriate, and musically, well, it's just damn impressive. If you ask me, people don't give a game's sound design enough credit for helping build its world, but luckily that's something you can find in spades here in survival horror. It's just a huge plus that the artist behind this work seemed to not only have done his homework, but was talented enough to pull off some absolutely killer music.
Father, what are you doing here?
Don't you see, child? I am eating some soup.
Well guys, I doubt very much what I'm about to say here will blow anyone's mind, but I fully endorse every single person, even the slightest bit interested in survival horror games, pick up Tormented Souls right now. It is an amazingly faithful representation of something I thought was dead. Survival horror is not the flashiest or most crowd-drawing genre in the world, and when you're a small indie developer, it can be rough to put a massive amount of work into a project you're almost guaranteed not to succeed at. So I'd like to do my part in ensuring these guys get the praise they most definitely deserve. Not only was this game like playing through some kind of acid trip into my most cherished gaming memories, but on top of all that, well, it's just fun. It plays like a bunch of games I already love, so from the start it was a safe bet. But the very second I actually started exploring the Wildberger Hospital, I knew this was more than just a simple homage. Listen, it is damn hard trying to figure out exactly what makes a game do well with its audience, but even tougher than that is the act of taking that concept and successfully implementing it into your own work. For a great example, look at all the failed attempts at making a faithful Silent Hill game in recent history. Each one of these titles were announced with the stated goal of offering that faithfully accurate SH experience, and each one of them failed that test miserably. But here we are, sitting right in front of a game that might have cost 1/10 that budget, and it's more RE and SH than officially released entries in both those series. That's amazing. So please do try Tormented Souls for yourself. It is an incredible experience, and I doubt very much you could find a modern game that sticks closer to such an old method of game design. You can snag it on Steam for a mere $20, which is an absolute pittance compared to the 16 hours and 3 playthroughs I put into it, and that's the same $20 that'll snag you it on PS5 and Xbox. It looks like PS4, Switch, and Xbox One ports are also coming pretty soon, so no excuses. Buy this game. Hell, buy it twice. Do whatever you can do to let this developer know their work is appreciated. I really can't tell you how great it is to finally play through a modern title that is this dedicated to bringing back the survival horror genre, but I sure as hell can try to make sure it succeeds at doing that. Pure and simple, from now on when someone asks me how the hell such an antiquated style of game could even work in the modern AAA landscape, instead of typing up some 3-page dissertation on a theoretical concept, I can just point at Tormented Souls and say that's how you do it. Hey guys, thanks for backtracking and puzzle solving your way through some creepy ass hospital with me. If you're into survival horror games, boy do I have a lot of videos for you. But if you'd like to ensure I'm able to keep doing this, maybe support these little projects over on Patreon or here via the channel membership program. Or maybe just share this video with a bud. Either way, I hope you had fun for a little bit, and here's hoping I see all of you again next time. Peace out, guys.